Hi, I'm Wendy from shinyhappyworld.com, and today I'm going to show you some tips on working with knit fabrics or stretch fabrics. I don't have a serger, so everything that I show you is going to be tips and tricks that you can use with any sewing machine. Let's get to it. So most t-shirt fabric only stretches in one direction. This one stretches this way. If you turn it the other way, you'll see that it has very little stretch in the other direction, and that's pretty common. What I want to do is show you some different stitches that you can use to make your seam go along that stretch so that your seam will have some stretch too. The first thing I'm going to do is just stitch a line with a regular stitch. Nothing fancy, just a straight stitch. So this is the same stitch that you would use for any cotton or non-stretchy fabric. And you'll notice that there's not much give in there. You just lost a lot of the stretch. My machine has a stretch stitch on there, so I'm going to reset it to the stretch stitch. And you'll see when I start to sew that the feed dogs are going to feed the fabric back and forth. And that gives it the magic that makes it a stretchy seam. So here we go with that, and see it's starting to go, it goes a couple of stitches forward and then a stitch back, a couple forward and one back. That's probably enough of that. So we'll pull that out. I'll hold that up so you can see that. Now that, you'll see it's a thicker stitch because it gets actually stitched over twice. And it has a lot more stretch. It's going to be a much stronger seam because of the extra stitching, and it's also going to give a lot more than this seam here. Now, if your machine does not have a stretch stitch, you can still sew on stretchy fabrics. What I'm going to do is sew it with a zigzag. When you have a zigzag stitch, you can make adjustments to the width of the stitch and also to the length of the stitch. So what I've done is a pretty narrow stitch because I don't want to have a big wide zigzag in here. So I've got a fairly narrow stitch and also a fairly long one. It'll give you a little bit more stretch, but your seam won't be quite as smooth. It really just depends on what you're doing. But here is, get that under the light better. Here is a slightly zigzaggier, it's a little bit wider, and it's got a lot of stretch to it. One more thing that I didn't talk about yet, but it's really, really important, is that you need to use a stretch needle when you're sewing knits. It's got a rounded end, so it kind of finds its way through any fabrics that you're stitching. This will keep, if you try and sew stretch fabrics with a regular needle, you're going to have your thread breaking a lot, and you're also going to, it's just not going to work. You're going to skip a lot of stitches, it's going to be messy, and you're probably going to swear a lot. So make sure you switch that out to a stretch needle, and it will make all the difference in the world. So that's a couple of tips on sewing with stretch fabric with a regular sewing machine. Remember that I don't have a serger, so I do all of my stretch sewing on a regular sewing machine. The number one most important thing to remember is to use a stretch needle. That will make all the difference in the world. You really cannot do it without a stretch needle. It's kind of a disaster. The other thing to think about is what stitch you want to use. You can use a regular stitch, the same kind of stitch you would use on cotton fabrics. You can use that on knit fabrics, but remember, that's going to take the stretch away. So for example, don't use it around the bottom of a t-shirt that you're going to need to stretch to get on, because those seams are going to pop. I do use a regular seam line, a regular stitch, when I'm sewing softies because I don't want those seams to stitch. I don't want the softie to get distorted when I stuff it. So I'll use a regular non-stretchy seam when I'm sewing those together. If you're sewing clothing, pretty much every seam that you sew you're going to want to stretch because those are designed, those patterns for knit fabrics are designed to have stretch on all of those seams. So for that, if your machine has a stretch stitch, you're going to want to use that stretch stitch. But if your machine does not have a stretch stitch, just use a zigzag stitch, and you want to make it kind of a flat and long zigzag, a longer, like low, wide mountains. So that's it. I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World. See you next time.